Unless they went to the other.
No, they know to come to this room. Okay, most people just want to sleep in a little bit because they have that option. Usually, if people are in the wrong room, they'll WhatsApp, and I just see that on the WhatsApp no one sent anything in. So let's get started from the beginning of the Gemara. Yesterday we ended off with an interesting concept that you're not supposed to use for matzah something that would not have the Isser Chametz, and Tevel, which would not have the Isser Chametz because we hold ein Isser Chalal Isser. Therefore, you cannot use Tevel for the matzah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's see the Gemara weiter. Now we have whole new shilas. Tanuraban Yochel Yoytze Adam Yidei Chavasai b'Ma'aser Sheni b'Yerushalayim. We know Ma'aser Sheni can only be eaten in Yerushalayim, but it could be eaten in Yerushalayim. So you might think that you're allowed to use it for matzah. Talmud Leimer Lechem Oini. The Torah refers to the matzah as Lechem Oini, and we learn it's Masha Nechal Baninos. It's something that could be eaten baninos. The matzah, the bread that we use for the matzah has to be something that you can eat in sadness, as an oinen. Yotzeh, which excludes meiser, she'einen nechal baninos. By meiser it says lo yachalti ba'oini mimenu. You're not allowed to eat meiser sheni when you're an oinen. So therefore, it's inconsistent with lechem oini. Ela b'simcha. The meiser sheni can only be eaten b'simcha. It cannot be eaten baninos. Therefore, you cannot use meiser sheni for matzah. Divrei Rabbi Yosy Aglili. That's what Rabbi Yosy Aglili holds. But Rabbi Kiva Omer, matzos riba. We had this riba of matzos. Since it says matzos multiple times, it's inclusive of even things such as meiser sheni. It's important to remember this shita of Rabbi Kiva because it's going to come into play on Amud Beis. So Rabbi Yosy Aglili holds you may not use meiser sheni for matzah, and Rabbi Kiva holds that you may use meiser sheni for matzah. Frek the Gemara. According to Rabbi Kiva, who doesn't exclude Meiser Sheni from the fact that the Torah says Lechem Oini, so what is the Torah trying to teach us when the Torah tells us Lechem Oini? So the Gemara Pratli Isa Sheni Lusha B'Yayin V'Shem Udvash. It tells us that dough, a bread or a matzah that you needed with Yayin Shem Udvash, which is matzah shira, it's not Lechem Oini. That you'll not be able to be yoy to the mitzvah of matzah with. My time with Rabbi Kiva. Why does Rabbi Kiva not want to use the lechem oini? Oh, 1 second. Somebody is asking us where the shares, I think. Okay. Yeah. 603 550.
Hey, good morning, yes.
Good morning. Good morning.
So I just asked a quick question from last night, but I couldn't get in my question because you were
sure.
You kept on saying about how when the lady went and he jumped in to get his own, to grab his meiser sheni, he kept on saying, oh, and then he's chayav to give the truma gedola as if it's his responsibility. I didn't understand. Wouldn't that be the farmer's responsibility, the original owners?
Can you say that again?
You said, sorry, let me just. You'd been saying how if the lady jumped in to go grab his meiser before the kohen showed up to get the truma, then you said that the lady himself was chayiv to go and take off truma gedola.
Correct.
Isn't the chiyuv of truma gedola on the farmer, the owner, the original owner of the wheat to take off? So instead of taking off 2, he takes off 1.8 bushels.
Right. So let's go do the numbers. We start off at 100 bushels. Really, the kohen was entitled to 2 bushels.
2.
But now the owner is only left with 90 bushels because he's already given 10 bushels to the Levi.
Mm.
So now when he's taking off 1/50th of what he has remaining, he's not going to give 2 bushels. He's going to give 1/50th of 90 bushels.
Oh, so only give 1.8, you're saying. So what's the point? Right. You're talking about the 0.2 bushels is what we're...
Exactly. So the 0.2 bushels is what the Levi would have to kick in if this whole thing occurred when it was already in kernel form. But if it was in stock form, when the Levi took his Meiser prematurely, then the Levi benefits. He gets the extra Meiser.
Why should he? He should be chayiv to give it. So the same amount of the two, the claim will get 1.8 from the farmer. He gets 0.2 from the Levi.
Right. So
why would we
the reason why he doesn't have to is because the Torah says there's a miyut. The Torah says that the Levi only has to give one truma from his chelik to the kohen, and that chelik that he has to give is trumas meiser, but not the truma gedola. So we had two psukim. One that says the Levi only has to give one truma, and another pasuk that says the Levi has to give multiple. So we apply the pasuk that says the Levi only has to give one truma is referring to when he got it early enough before the chiyuv truma was triggered. But if he came later to do the same thing and take early, but it was already in kernel form, then we would force the Levi to give the kohen his share of the truma gedola as well.
Got it. Okay.
It's all based on the Gzeres Kosov.
Okay. What?
And it's all based on the Gzeres Kosov, like it's limudim.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
There's logic to say why one we should apply to one pasuk and one to the other pasuk. The more along it is in the process, the more mustaber it is that the kohen already has his rights to it. But the whole concept that the Levi can take prematurely, that's Gzeres Kosov. Because like you said, why doesn't he have to give him his part? Logic would dictate that he does, but the Torah tells us that he doesn't.
Okay, so let's see. One truma, that's it. Got it. Okay, thank you.
Correct. He only has to give the trumas meiser.
Right, got it.
Which is a lot more. That's 1/10 of what he has versus 1/50.
Right.
Okay, so let's see what the Gemara says. So the Gemara now is discussing: are you allowed to make matzah out of meiser sheni? Rabbi Yosy clearly says not, because it says lechem oini, lechem of aninus, and meiser sheni you're not allowed to eat when you're in oinen. And Rabbi Kiva says we had it yesterday. It says matzah multiple times to be inclusive, which would include meiser sheni. You are allowed to make matzahs out of meiser sheni, and it's important to remember this. Rabbi Kiva holds you're allowed to make matzah out of meiser sheni, and that will be relevant again on Amud Beis. So the question is, what does Rabbi Kiva learn out of the lechem oini? It's called matzah shira. Matzah that you've used wine, oil, or honey in, that's called matzah shira, and therefore you would not be able to use it for your matzahs. My time at Rabbi Kiva, why doesn't Rabbi Kiva darshan like Rabbi Yosy Glili that lechem oini miloshen aninus, and you're sort of making the ayin into an aleph? Zok the Gemara miksiv lechem oini oniksiv. When it says lechem oini in the pasuk, it doesn't have a vav. It's written chaser, so it says lechem oni. So it makes sense for me to darshan that it should be lechem avanius to exclude matzah shira, rather than darshan it as oini like you Rabbi Yosy Glili. Rabbi Yosy Glili mi karinan oni oini karinan. Sure, it doesn't have a vav, but we still read it as oini, and therefore it makes sense to learn it like I did to exclude meiser sheni. Rabbi Kiva, hi the karinan be oini. The reason why I use the word oini is not to substitute an ayin with that aleph and learn it's lechem oini, so that a meiser which is not eaten by ninas wouldn't work. It's rather a different halacha like we're familiar with. Shmuel lechem oini is lechem she'oinin alav dvarim harbe. The matzah, till you can eat it, we learn a lot of Haggadah about it. There's a lot of conversation, a lot of talk, a lot of saying the Haggadah when you eat the matzah, and that's why it's called lechem oini. Nothing to do with ninos and meiser sheni. So the Gemara, v'savar Rabbi Kiva isa sheni lusha v'yayin v'shemen udvash loy. Are you telling me that Rabbi Kiva holds that matzah shira cannot be used to be yotzei the mitzvah of matzah on the Seder night? V'atanya we learned ein loshen isa b'Pesach. You're not allowed to knead dough. You're not allowed to make dough with yayin, shemen, udvash. You're not allowed to make it with yayin, shemen, udvash. One second, I just have to make a quick adjustment. Okay, the imlosh, and if you did do it, Rabbi Gamliel Omer tisarif miyad, burn it right away because we're afraid it'll become chametzik. Because may perish are machmet right away, so you must burn it immediately. V'chachamim yoichel, eat it. There's no rush. You can eat it. So that you can bake it and eat it, and you don't have a problem. V'chachamim yoichel. V'amar Rabbi Kiva, and Rabbi Kiva said, shafti hoisya Eitzel Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shua. Once upon a time, I spent Pesach in the home of Rebbe Elazar and Rebbe Shua, and what happened there is, I guess I helped. I wasn't just freeloading. I was a guest in the kitchen there. I was helping in the kitchen. Velashti lahamisa v'yayin shem midvash, and I actually helped them make the dough, and I kneaded it with yayin shem midvash. And this was for the first Seder night. I was helping in the kitchen, preparing for the Seder, and I used yayin shem midvash, and they didn't protest. So clearly, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shua hold that you're even allowed to use matzah shira for the Seder, which is going to be our kasha, because Rabbi Kiva just said earlier that you cannot use matzah shira for the Seder, for the matzahs of mitzvah. You see here, Rabbi Kiva made it for Rabbi Eliezer and Yeshua, and they had no problem with it. And now the brisa goes on. Even though the Tanakama said earlier that you're not allowed to knead the dough with yayin shem and dvash, mikatfimba, you can glaze it. You know, people glaze their challah with eggs, so you can glaze your matzah with yayin shem and dvash. Zok Gemara, that's awesome. The Tanakama, even the Tanakama who mentioned earlier that you're not allowed to knead it, you're not allowed to use it as an ingredient of the dough, they still hold that you would be allowed to glaze the dough, the matzah, with yayin shem and dvash. The Chama argue, and they say es shaloshin boy mikatfim boy, anything that you're allowed to use as an ingredient for the dough, you'd be allowed to glaze the dough with. The es she'ein loshin boy ein mikatfim boy, but if you're not allowed to use it as an ingredient, you're not allowed to glaze with it either. Vishavin, and they all agree, she'ein loshin she'isa b'paishrin. Everybody agrees you're not allowed to use warm water when you're kneading the dough for the matzah's mitzvah. If I'm not mistaken, one of the reasons why they leave the water overnight, why it's mayim shalanu, is that it should cool off. It should stay cool. They didn't have refrigeration in those days. Zok Gemara, so we have a steer now. Rabbi Kiva earlier said that you're not allowed to use matzah shir for the Seder. Yet in this brisa, Rabbi Kiva used it, and Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shua didn't even protest. The brisa that says that he used matzah shira and no one complained, that was not for the Seder. That was for one of the other days of Pesach. When Rabbi Kiva said you're not allowed to use matzah shira, he was referring to the Sedarim. For the matzah of mitzvah, that's where it needs to be lechamoni. That's where you cannot use matzah shira. Could Amar Lahu Rabbi Yeshua lebret b'nei, the Bach 6 and Rabbi Shua ben Levi. Could Amar Lahu Rabbi Shua ben Levi lebnei, like Rabbi Shua ben Levi told his children, Yom HaKama for the first night of Pesach, where we have to be yoytze the mitzvah of achilas matzah, loisa lushli bechalba. Don't knead the dough for me with milk. Mikan velech, but the rest of the nights, lushli bechalba, you can use milk. For the Gemara, how could you say that? For Tanya, we learned ein loshen es ha'isa b'chalav. You're never allowed to use milchiks, dairy, in any type of dough, because there's a problem of kilk, there's a problem of takala. And if you did, like we learned that if you make a bread, we learned earlier in the case of baking a bread in an oven that was fleischiks, you're not allowed to use it because people will assume it's parv, they might use it with milk. Here it's the opposite. If you make it with milk, you're not allowed to use it because people will think it's parv and they eat it with meat. Rather, this is what Rabbi Shua ben Levi must have said. Don't make the matzah with honey. But mikan veilach for the rest of Pesach, where it's not the mitzvah of achilas matzah, lushali bedufsha gesintahait, you can mix honey into the dough. It means with milk. Kidu amar Ravina ke'ein tura shari. Ravina said if you bake the bread a small little pilka like the eye of a bull, that will be mutter. Hachanami ke'ein tura. So too over here, what he meant was Rabbi Shua ben Levi is make me small little breads, where it's not going to hang around. I'll just eat it right away, so I won't forget. If you make a big bread that'll last for a couple of days, you might forget what you originally made it, how you originally made it, and use it with meat. But if it's just a small little piece of bread, you'll eat it quickly, and it won't come to the color. That's one shot. The other shot is Ke'ein Tura, is they made it in the shape of an ox, in the shape of a cow, so you should know it's milchiks, I guess. And it's like what we learned before. If you fold it, if you make it a different way, then you don't have a problem, which explains why all of our danishes, our cheese danishes, are always made in a different shape than the rest of the danishes, like we learned a couple of days ago. The same thing is to show that this is not standard bread. This has milchik properties. It's interesting to note that there was a havamina that that they wanted to knead the bread with milk, because there's a famous story, I think, with Reb Chaim Brisker, where someone came to Reb Chaim Brisker and asked if you could be yoytze the arba koises with milk. Somebody asked Reb Chaim Brisker such a shaila, and right away he raised money for the guy, because he chapped, if he's asking if he can use milk for the arba koises, that means he can't even afford meat for Yom Tov, because if he could afford meat, he wouldn't be able to ask such a question. So he quickly got to seed money that he should be able to buy himself meat for Yom Tov. So it looks like Rabbi Shua Levi, at least in this pshat, that he wanted to use milk for the matzahs mitzvah, or he had a habit to use milk for the matzahs mitzvah. Maybe he didn't either have money for meat, or it could be he had money for meat for the first night, and the first night he didn't want it with cholov, but the other nights he was able to have milk matzahs, because I guess he didn't have meat. Okay, so hey, look Gemara weiter. My shna mi menachos. So the Gemara says v'shavin. We just learned that you're not allowed to make matzah with warm water. We know all of the menachos were not allowed to be chametz. Yet, that nan kol menachos niloishes bepoishrin v'shoimran or mishamran. Says v'shoimran or mishamran is what it says over here. Umishamran. So they would use warm water when they mixed the flour of the mincha. Now, we're not talking about a mincha soilus where there was no water involved, but there were other menachas that were baked first, and they were kneaded. So those ones you had to mix water into, and they did use water. Why weren't you worried over there that it would become chametz? So it's called menachas nilosh b'poishrin u'mishamron shelo yechmetzu. So if there you can be careful that it shouldn't become chametzik, why can't you use warm water when you need matzahs and just be careful? So reason, if they said in the Beis Hamikdash that Kohanim's reason, they get things right, they'll make sure to prevent this dough from becoming chametz. Reason, you think we can apply that kula to everybody who bakes matzahs, that they'll be reason like the Kohanim, and they'll make sure that it won't become chametz? Of course not. And therefore, this is an exception that's allowed in the Beis Hamikdash for the menachos, but of course, everybody in their personal kitchen cannot use warm water because we're concerned that it'll let it become chametz. In fact, Gemara ihachi milsus nami losses. What they used to do is they used to soak the kernels of wheat in water before they ground them to separate the bran from them so that it should be pure white flour. That's also a chash of chametz if you don't work quickly. So by the mincha, which was done through his reason, why didn't we allow milsus nami losses? Why didn't we allow them to soak the kernels to get rid of the bran? Alama Amar Abzeir Amar Rabba Bar Yirmiyah Amar Shmuel that chitin shel menachos ein loises in Isa. If there's reason, why can't they do that? And for the Gemara, Elisha bez reason Isa. The Elisha, when they kneaded the dough of the mincha, that was done in the Beis Hamikdash. Therefore, there's reason involved, and we can allow them to use warm water. But Lasisa, the person who was donating the mincha, he came with flour to the Beis Hamikdash. So that process of Lasisa would have been done in his own personal home. Lasisa, less of his reason. The Lasisa occurs at home, in someone's personal home, where he's not a Zoris. There we're concerned it will become chametz. But the Lisha, which was done in the Beis Hamikdash, that's done through his reason, so we're not worried and we allow you to use warm water. In fact, the more of Elisha mi Isa is reason. Are you telling me that the Kohanim, they do the Lisha? It's not true. Because Vaksiv, V'yotak Allah Hashemen, V'not Allah Levoina, and then it says Ve'vi Allah Koyin. And we learn from there that all of the avoidance of the mincha up until the kmitza can be done with a zar, with a non-zars. Mikmitza ve'elech mitzvahs kahuna. But only from the kmitza on is the koyin the zar is involved. Limit al yitzika ubli loshek sher b'chol adam. Anyone could do it, even a non-zars. So why are you not concerned that if you use warm water in the lisha, it will become chametz? Shakamar lisha nehida bezrizan lesa, even though it's not being done by the kahanim, but the makam's reason isa. That's done in the Beis Hamikdash, where they're surrounded with reason. And if you're surrounded with reason, if you're in a place where the oilam is moving, you're going to move it also. The Amar Mar, the Lilak Sheir Bazar, mixing the mincha to prepare it, Azar can do what Yisrael can do, but Chutz L'chaimis Azar Apsula. But out of the Azar, you can't do it. So something that's done in the azar, where you're under the influence of reason, and there's kahanim watching, and everyone's moving quickly, there even the Yisrael will not let the dough become chometz, and he'll make sure that even if he uses warm water, it'll be okay. Lafuka lasisa, but lasisa, which is soaking the kernel to separate the bran, the einab is reason, v'loy b'makom is reason. It's not done by kohanim, and it's not even done in the Beis Hamikdash. There, people could be slow about it, and it could come to chometz. And that's why it's not allowed. What about the minchas omer? The Tanya we learned, minchas omer, which was the mincha that was brought from the first wheat on the second day of Pesach. It says minchas omer loises in isa. You're allowed to soak it. And then they would pile up they would soak the wheat and then pile it up to drain off. So over there you're making lasisa, and that's not in the Beis Hamikdash. Yet there wasn't a problem. The Gemara tzibur shiny. Since it was a public mincha, it was a mincha that was brought by the tzibur under the guidance and under the supervision of the Beis Nagadol, something that's so carefully watched and done under the guidance of the Beis Nagadol. In other words, the Mashgiach standing right there. When the Mashgiach standing right there, everybody makes sure to do things right, and therefore the minchas ha'omer, they were even allowed to do the lasisa they were even allowed to do lasisa, which puts it into danger of becoming chametz. Tanrabanan. You might think you might have thought that a person could be yoytze the mitzvah of matzah with bikurim, so the kohen received wheat from the Yisrael as bikurim. You might think he could use that wheat to make matzah for Pesach. Talmud Leimer b'chol moishvei seichem toichlu matzahs. You can eat matzahs wherever you are. Matzah hanachelas b'chol moishvei seichem. Only wheat that you can eat anywhere. Only that's the type of wheat that you're allowed to use for your matzah. Yotzu bikurim she'ena cholin b'chol moshvei seichem ela b'Yerushalayim divrei Rabbi Yosy Simon. Rabbi Yosy Simon holds. How do I know that you're not allowed to make matzah out of bikurim? Is because we know bikurim you're only allowed to eat in Yerushalayim, because it says in the pasuk Rashi says shenemer lo suchal lechol b'sharecha. And if we look at the pasuk inside, I believe we have the pasuk at the side of the Gemara. It says lo suchal lechol b'sharecha. Oh, do we have it over here? We don't have it over here, so we're going to have it on Amud Beis. We're going to have the pasuk. Let me see if I can bring it up. Leisucha lechol b'sharecha. It's right over here. Leisucha lechol b'sharecha. Ma'aser degandcha v'siroishcha v'yitzarecha u'v'koris b'korcha v'tzoincha b'chol darecha asher tidar v'nizvesecha u'truma shadecha. And I believe truma shadecha is referring to bikurim. You're not allowed to eat bikurim out of Yerushalayim, and the matzah you have to be able to eat b'chol moshvei seichem. And therefore, you cannot make matzah out of bikurim. Divrei Rabbi Yosy Aglili. Rabbi Kiva Omer, we know it from a different source. Matzah umor. It says al matzah somrim yechlu. So matzah and mor are sort of linked together. There's a hekesh between them, and we learn ma mor she'eni bikurim. Just like mor cannot be bikurim, because any of the species that you're allowed to use for mor are not from the shivas aminim, from which you would bring bikurim. Therefore, af matzah she'eni bikurim. So too, the matzah cannot be bikurim. If the mor cannot be bikurim, the matzah cannot be bikurim. Frank the Gemara, let's take that hekesh a step further. Ima mor she'en b'minay bikurim. Just like by mor, you're not allowed to use a species that you bring bikurim from. Af matzah she'en b'minay bikurim. Maybe you should learn that you're not allowed to make matzah out of a species that you bring bikurim from, which would exclude all of the grains. Oitzi. So that would actually exclude, based on your hekesh of comparing matzah to mor, you would actually disqualify chitin and sarin, which is unheard of, to make matzah out of, if you want to learn it from mor. Talmud Leimer matzah is riba. Again, we're referring to that inclusive lashon of matzah is to say that you're allowed to make matzahs out of chitin and sarin. In fact, the Gemara matzah is riba, then afilu bikurim nami. So once you're telling me to disregard the hekesh because you want to make matzah inclusive, so then let's say as well that we disregard the hekesh related to, let's say we disregard the hekesh related to, let's say we related to bikurim as well. Zok Gemara, Hader Bei Rabbi Kiva. In fact, Rabbi Kiva reversed his opinion, and his makar of where he learns that you're not allowed to bring matzah, you're not allowed to make matzah out of bikurim, is not from the hekesh of matzah anymore. And he's going to learn it out of the same place as Rabbi Yosy Glili. You're only allowed to make matzah out of something that you can eat everywhere. How do I know that Rabbi Akiva backed out of his hekesh? The Tanya, because we have a brisa. You might think someone could be yoytze his mitzvah of matzah with bikurim. Now we don't know who the author of this brisa is. This brisa is quoted without saying who it was. The last brisa brought down the machloikis between Rabbi Yosy Glili and Rabbi Akiva, where you know it. But this brisa doesn't say who the Tana is. So let's see what the brisa says. You're not allowed to use bikurim for matzah because of the limud that Rabbi Yosy Glili said earlier, that was bechol moish v'seichem toich l'matzos, and we dash in matzah nachelos bechol moishavos yotzu bikurim she'einu cholim bechol moishavos ela b'Yerushalayim. Bikurim could only be eaten in Yerushalayim. Yochel, you might think shani moitzi af ma'aser sheni. You might think that ma'aser sheni as well, which can only be eaten in Yerushalayim. You might think that you're not allowed to use matzah of ma'aser sheni. Talmud Loimer, matzos. Again, we have this matzos that's inclusive. Riba, it's marba that you could make the matzah out of ma'aser sheni. Why would you include ma'aser sheni and say that you're allowed to make matzah out of ma'aser sheni, but you're not allowed to make matzah out of bikurim? So tomorrow, marba ni ma'aser sheni sheyesh lo heter b'chol ma'ashavos. Ma'aser sheni, even once it gets into Yerushalayim, there is a way where you'd be able to use that ma'aser sheni everywhere else. Now, Rashi tells us earlier that ma'aser sheni, when you have it not in Yerushalayim, you could be poided. But once you bring the ma'aser sheni up to Yerushalayim, you have to eat it there. You may no longer be poided, and then use it out of Yerushalayim, because the mechitzas of Yerushalayim are koltos. Once they get in, once the ma'aser sheni gets into Yerushalayim, it's locked there. So it would be just like bikurim. So if we're going to exclude bikurim because of b'chol moish v'seichem, why don't we also exclude ma'aser sheni from b'chol moish v'seichem? So Akdamar K'di Rabbi Elazar, because Rabbi Elazar holds that there is a way where even if the ma'aser sheni was brought up to Yerushalayim, there's a way where you could be paid it, and we're going to see in a moment that's if it became tamei. If the ma'aser sheni became tamei in Yerushalayim, you could be paid it even in Yerushalayim, and therefore it will be able to be removed from Yerushalayim. So Rashi Rabbi Elazar, the nitma paidinaisai. If the ma'aser sheni became tamei, paidinaisai, you redeem it, and then you would be able to eat it anywhere, even not in Yerushalayim. Even though now I have ma'aser sheni in Yerushalayim that's not tamei, if I wasn't paid it, I could be yoytze with it, because there is a path for it to be able to be taken out of Yerushalayim. But I exclude bikurim from the mitzvah of matzah, because bikurim you could never eat out of Yerushalayim. How do you know that ma'aser sheni that became tamei, you're allowed to be paid even if it was in Yerushalayim? Talmud Loimer kilei suchol se'esai. So the pasuk says, if it's very far for you to schlep your ma'aser sheni to Yerushalayim, kilei suchol se'esai, you cannot carry it. So what does that mean, se'esai? The ain says ela achila. When it says la suchol se'esai, it means you cannot eat it. Where do you know that se'es means eating? Shenemar, from our parsha that we just had in Parshas Miketz. It says, Vayisa masas me'ez panav. The pasuk says, Vayisa masas me'ez panav, aleim, he brought them all portions of food. I can't read this. The Tarav masas binyamin and masas kulam. Chamish yodesh. And Yosef gave Binyamin a portion that was 5 times the size of the portion that he gave to the brothers. So you see the lashon masas as food. So when it says it means you can be paid it. So the pashut of the pasuk is, if you're in a regular city, you're not in Yerushalayim, and you have too much ma'aser sheni, you can't schlep it all up to Yerushalayim, you can be paid it. But as a secondary interpretation of the pasuk is, even if it's in Yerushalayim, but you could no longer eat it because it became tamei, so then you're allowed to be pointed. So this is the end of the brisa. So let's think. This is an anonymous brisa. Who is the author of this brisa? So let's think. Man shamas lei the Omar the Ma'aser Sheni Nafik Bey. Who holds that you're allowed to make matzah with Ma'aser Sheni? We had a machlokes on Amar Aleph. Rabbi Akiva said you were. Rabbi Yosy Glila says you because of lechem oini, you were not allowed to make matzah out of Ma'aser Sheni. And Rabbi Akiva argued, and Rabbi Akiva said you could make matzah out of Ma'aser Sheni. So who is the Tana who holds that you could make matzah out of Ma'aser Sheni? It's Rabbi Akiva. So that means this brisa that clearly states that you could make your matzah out of Ma'aser Sheni, the author of this brisa must be Rabbi Akiva. And and in this brisa, what is the limud to exclude bikurim from the mitzvah of matzah? So you see that Rabbi Akiva, who originally said you knew that you can't make matzah bikurim, you know from the hekesh to chametz, you see that Rabbi Akiva abandoned that svara, and he subscribes to Rabbi Yosy Glili's raya of b'chol moshe v'seichem. Zok the Gemara vayt. Yes. You're breaking up. Shlomi, can you hear Chaim? No, I don't hear him either. Chaim, I cannot hear you. I can't hear you, and Shlomi finds I can't hear you. So I'll assume that nobody else can hear you. So just cut in whenever you're ready. Whenever you get a better reception, just cut in. Okay, Zok to Gemara. Rabbi Yosy Glili. Rabbi Yosy Glili, how did he learn? What was his makar that you're not allowed to use Ma'aser Sheni for your matzahs? He learned it out of Lechem Oini, and he made the ayin into an aleph, and it says by Ma'aser Sheni Le'achalti ba'oini mimenu, I won't eat it ba'ninus, but Lechem Oini clearly is compatible with aninus, so that's how he knew that you cannot use Ma'aser Sheni to make your matzah with. Zok to Gemara, why don't you use that same Lechem Oini to exclude Bikurim? Why did he need the pasuk of B'chol Moshe V'Seichem? Rabbi Yosy Glili, typically, why don't you learn that Bikurim cannot be used for your matzah, mi Lechem Oini? And I would darshan it as follows. Misha Nechal Ba'oini, the only type of grain you're allowed to use for matzah is grain that you can eat baninus, Lechem Oini, Yotzazeh, which would exclude Bikurim, because Bikurim has to be eaten b'simcha. Let's see what Rashi says. Rashi says, where does it say that Bikurim has to be eaten b'simcha? Bikurim has to be eaten b'simcha, it says. There's a pasuk somewhere that tells us that it has to be eaten b'simcha. Okay, we'll see in a minute. Zakt Gemara, Savala Reb Shimon. Let's say that Rabbi Yosy Glili holds like Reb Shimon. The Tanya Bikurim Asurim Lo'inin. Bikurim is usher for an oinin to eat. For Reb Shimon Mater, and Reb Shimon holds its mutter for an oinin to eat. So if Rabbi Yosy Glili holds like Reb Shimon that it's a mutter for an oinin to eat, therefore it will not be a stira to lechem oini, and that's why Rabbi Yosy Glili had to use the pasuk of b'chol moshe v'seichem, since Bikurim can only be eaten in Yerushalayim, and matzah has to be made out of something that can be eaten anywhere. My time of the Rabban, no, the Gemara brings the pasuk. What as far as the Rabban who holds that an oinin may not eat bikurim? Yechsiv leisucha lechel b'sharecha v'amar mar shumasyotcha edel bikurim. So what does it say in the pasuk? We had it before. Leisucha lechel b'sharecha. You cannot eat anywhere. Ma'aseh the gantcha tiroshcha v'tzarecha, and all the way to end is a trumashadecha, which we say means bikurim, and it's listed in the same pasuk side by side with meiser. And we learn it from Meiser. The Ishkush Bikurim la Meiser. Bikurim is compared to Meiser. Ma Meiser also lo'inin, af Bikurim also lo'inin. It's interesting that if we have a hekesh from Meiser Sheni to Bikurim to tell you that it's also to the oinin, and then as a byproduct of that, we'll also know that you cannot use Bikurim for matzah. We could have just learned direct, just like Meiser Sheni, just like Meiser. You cannot use it for your matzah, so to Bikurim, you cannot use it for your matzah. But this is what the Gemara says. Reb Shimon who holds that you are allowed to eat Bikurim when you're an oinin. What about what about the hekesh to Ma'aser Sheni? Zaktumar teruma karinu rachmana. It says a trumas yotcha. We're referring to bikurim as a truma. So kit truma, it'll have halachas similar to truma. Ma truma muteris loinin, af bikurim muteris muter loinin. So you want to compare it to Ma'aser Sheni because it's in the same pasuk. I'm going to go minei obey. It's the Torah directly calls bikurim truma, and truma we know is muter to an oinen to eat. So to bikurim would be muter to an oinen to eat, and that's why Rabbi Yosy Glili needed a separate pasuk to exclude bikurim from making it a matzah because of b'chol mashvasechem. Rabbi Shimon he the hekesh leslie. Okay, he doesn't have a hekesh between meiser and bikurim to say that you're not allowed to eat it when you're an oinen. But simcha miya michtav ksivabu. But it does say simcha directly by the mitzvah bikurim. It says v'samachta b'chol hatoiv in the parsha bikurim. So you see clearly that there is a mitzvah of simcha by bikurim. And if that's the case, logically we should say that you're not allowed to eat it when you're an oinen. So Dr. Gemara, no, that simcha is not telling you about your situation when you eat it. You're allowed to eat it when you're an oinen. Rather, that simcha is telling us a different halacha. It's telling us when is the proper time to bring bikurim. The proper time to bring bikurim is in the season of joy, the festive season, and that doesn't mean December. The festive season, Zok the Heilige Gemara, is the Tnan me'atzeres v'adachag from Shavuos to Sukkot. That is the happiest season in Klal Yisrael because that's the harvest season. All winter long, your produce grows, and come Shavuos, everything is harvested. And from Shavuos until Sukkot is considered the harvest season. That is a very happy time. Therefore, maybe Vikairi. That's the ideal time to bring Bikurim. And then you would also say the whole parsha of Bikurim, which talks about the Simcha Bikurim, that's when you do it, if you do it during the right time. So Rashi says, Zman Simcha b'Zman Katsira Ulakita, harvesting season. Shadam Loike Tfu Osai, V'Liboy Semeach, there it's Tzrichu Akas of Kriya, Dairami Oidu V'Ravi. Then he says the whole parsha of Bikurim, where he's gushing his thanks to the Rebbeinu Shalom for his good fortune. Me'achag vat Chanukah, from Sukkot until Chanukah, where you're still enjoying your harvest, but it's not in the heat of the harvest where it's all exciting. Maybe you could still bring Bikurim, but ve'enei koyer, you can no longer say the parsha of Bikurim. Tanur Rabbanan, we learned Lechamoini. Let me just see if it says, I believe that after Chanukah, you're not supposed to bring Bikurim at all. Okay, so Gemara weiter. Lechamoini, Tanur Rabbanan, Lechamoini, Prat, Lechalut, Ulashisha.
I guess Rashi says it.
Oh, Rashi does say it? I thought I saw it. But where does Rashi say it?
Me'achag v'at Chanukah. A little lower.
A little bit lower. Oh, V'arachag, Me'achag v'at Chanukah. Einei Zman Simcha, very good, Shkoyach. The Einei Koirei. And there you don't say the parsha of Bikurim, but Mechanukah ve'elech, Einei Zman Avah. Then you don't bring Bikurim at all. The Tanya B'Sefri, Asher Tovi Me'artzecha, Kozman Shemetzuyin Al Pnei Artzecha, Shalai Kolu L'chayim and Asada. As long as there's still produce lying around on the field, you can bring Bikurim. But once there's nothing left on the field, Chanukah time already, it snows, there's nothing left on the field, at that point you can no longer bring Bikurim. Okay, Zok to Gemara. A new type of matzah. Zok to Heilig Gemara. Tanur Rabbanan. Lechamoini prat l'cholot. Cholot, I believe, means it's boiled. I think that's the way they make bagels. Ule ashisha. Ashisha Rashi says is gluska gedoyla. It's a big, beautiful type of matzah, like a suda matzah. That you're not supposed to use for the seder because that's not called lechamani. You might think the only type of pas you can use is pas hadra, and Rashi says it means shenitel kol hadara. All of its beauty is stripped out of it. Tanu pas kibur. That means not the white flour, but the whole wheat flour, full grain flour that has all the psoilus in it, and that's real lechamani. Talmud Leimer matzos riba. Once again, we have the matzos that's being inclusive, which would mean vafilu kematzos shel shloima, even like the matzos of Shloima. Rashi says shoya mu'unuk. He was a gepashet mensch. He was the son of a king. Klaimer soilus nakia. He would use soilus nakia. There's the common phrase of kesudas shloima melech b'shaitai. Whenever you're talking about high-end food, we always refer to the sudas of shloima melech. So you're allowed to have white flour. You just can't have it boiled, nor can you have it in a very large matzah. Himkain ma tamad loimer lechamani. So what does the lechem only teach you? Prat lechalot ula shisha. That's just excluding not white flour, but it's including the boiled and the very large challah. Umay mashma the hay ashisha lishnu de chashivusa. How do you know that ashisha is chashiv? The chsiv it says v'chalik l'chalaam is v'chalik l'chalaam l'chal hamon Yisrael. They gave out shrayim to all of Klal Yisrael. L'maish var isha, and leish they gave chalas lechem achas, the eshbor achas, v'ashisha achas, v'yelech chalaam ish leveisai. So you see that was given out in a royal situation. V'amar Rab Chana bar Abba ashbor echad mishisha b'par. The ashbar is a very large quantity. It's 1/6 of a cow. So they were given a huge piece of meat. Ashisha, it means echad mishisha be'efa. How much bread did they get? 1/6 of an ephah, which again is a very large amount. Upliga de Shmuel, he argues on Shmuel. Damar Shmuel, ashisha is a garba de chamra, and Rashi says it's not referring to bread, rather it's referring to an amount of wine. Dichsiv, vayhave, let's read the pasuk inside. Let's read it. It's Vayomer Hashem Elai, Oid Leich, Ehav Isha, Ahav Asura, When Eves Ba'ava Hashem es Pnei Yisrael, V'heim Poin Elohim Achem, Vayhave Ashisha Yanovim. So you see, it has to do with grapes. Okay, let's see where we're holding. Oh, we'll have a little bit of time. Okay, I didn't prepare this, but we'll do a run for it. Tanu Rabban, Ein Oifin Pas Ava B'Yom Tov B'Pesach. Let me see what the Girsa says in Ches. Ches says Lesser Tevis Yom Tov. Okay, so we'll skip out the word Yom Tov. Ein Oifin Pas Ava B'Pesach. You don't bake a thick bread on Pesach. Divrei Beis Shammai, these are the words of Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel matirin, and Beis Hillel allows you to bake a thick bread. The chama pasava, how big is a thick bread? Rav Huna tefach. It means if the bread is a tefach thick. Zogt Rashi, the chama pasava tefach. Va'afilu hachi sharu Beis Hillel. Even up to a tefach, Beis Hillel does allow you to bake bread that thick. Avol tfei mitefach loy. But even Beis Hillel would not allow you to bake a bread on Pesach that was thicker than a tefach. Amar Rav Huna, why tefach? Where does tefach come from? Shekein matinu b'lechem aponim tefach. You find that the lechem aponim in the Beis Hamikdash was a tefach, and the lechem aponim was not chametz. So Rashi, shekein matinu b'lechem aponim, shu aser lo v'chametz. You're not allowed to bring the lechem aponim chametzik. Kidamrinu b'menachos kol mincha sheshakrivu. The rabbis lechem aponim lechimutz la'asara shelo yachmitzu. There's a law. You're not allowed to allow the lechem aponim to become chametz. Va'afilu hachi oived fanois of tefach. The thickness of the wall of the lechem aponim was a tefach. The hanyu lechem shahayu loy ponim. It was called lechem aponim. It had a face to it. It had like dimensions. It was 3-dimensional. The ein ponim chachusim mitefach. It would not be called a ponim if it was less than a tefach. So since the lechem aponim was a tefach, and we know it was not chametz, therefore you'd be allowed to bake bread a tefach, up to a tefach thick, according to Beis Hillel. Maskav lo Rabbi Yosef. Frek Rabbi Yosef akasha. Im amru. Biz reason, just because they allowed a tefach in the Beis Hamikdash, where there's kaihanim, there's reason, so they're going to be careful that it shouldn't become chametz. Yomu b'she'im, there's reason. Are you going to also learn Beis Hillel that should apply to everybody? That you could bake matzah that's a tefach thick? Who said maybe that will become chametz? Im amru b'pas hamela, yomu b'pas she'ein hamela. So let's see what this means. Of Rashi, im amru v'tiru v'tefach, there's reason our kaihanim shebekin b'shimurai. They're keen in making sure Shalayachmitz Yatiru L'chol Olam Shein's reason. Just because we're allowing it to be done in the Beis Hamikdash, where the Kohanim are reason and they're careful, is that a reason why we should allow everybody? And the next time was Amr b'Pas Hamela. What is b'Pas Hamela? She'enim Maheres Lahachmitz. The bread, the dough that they made the lechem aponim out of, did not become easily chametz. She'amelasa makvasa. What is amela? Braira kedetnan. They banged it, they patted it. So since they banged it and patted it so much, they sort of knocked the wind out of it. And therefore, it wasn't going to become chametz that easily. But normal bread that you make could become chametz. And then the third time was im omer be'etzim yeveshim yomru be'etzim lachim. If we said, I guess in the base of Mikdash they only use dried out wood where there's no moisture. Maybe over there they allowed you to bake the bread where there's very little moisture and it wouldn't be likely to become chametz. But at home you can use any type of wood, even wood that's not dried out, that could lead to chametz. If they said that you're allowed to do it by Tanach Cham, because b'chol yom tamid v'yomasikin tanach shal mikdash lafis menachos v'lachmei toida v'shal matchasaya. The oven in the base of mikdash was metal and it was kept hot the whole time. So when they put it into the oven, it baked instantly. Would they still be allowed to make it? I guess in your own oven, you might put it into the oven where the oven isn't as hot. The oven in the base of mikdash was always so hot it bakes instantly, and it wouldn't become chametz. But in your oven, maybe it's not so hot right away, and therefore maybe it would become chametz. Or Rashi gives us information about etzim yiveshim. So they always would bring the wood in the base of mikdash from the summertime where they dried out. Like we learned in Mesechus Tainis, from the 15th day of an on is Tasha Koicha Shachama. The sun already starts to weaken, things start to cool down. Once it wasn't in the heat of summer, they would stop bringing wood to the maracha. They only wanted to bring it where it was very, very dried out. Just because they allowed it in a metal tanner, which heats up very quickly, would they allow you to bake bread in a typical oven like you have at home, which was made out of cheres? So there was a whole bunch of tainis why you shouldn't be able to bring a raya from the lechem aponim that you're allowed to bake bread that's even a tefach. So let's just quickly chazer over these tainis. Tefach. You find there it's a tefach and it didn't become chametz. So the first time there was a mamur b'zizin yom rishayis reason, just because it applies to kahanim, who said it applies to every Joe? If it applies to bread that you beat it to death so that it can't become chametz, who said they would allow this kula even on standard dough? The third time was dried woods are different, so that's the third time. The fourth time was maybe only in the base of mikdash where the oven was constantly being heated. There it would bake right away, it wouldn't become chametz, but in your own oven that you are in the middle of heating it up, when you put the dough into it, maybe then it would become chametz. And the fifth time was so there are 5 times on Basil why you shouldn't be able to make a raya from lechem aponim that you're allowed to bake matzah that's even a tefach thing. I asked Rebbe B'yichud, what does that mean? Dr. Rashi, there's pas maruba, which was another time. Oh, that's later on. But let's see what B'yichud means. B'yichud, Beini Leveni, right? I asked him a question one-on-one. I asked Rabbi Yirmiyah a question. Rabbi Yirmiyah said, I asked Rebbe one-on-one. Beini Leveni, Rabbi Yirmiyah was Rav. Rabbi Yirmiyah Rav, Rabbi, the Rav Rabbeinu HaKadosh. So it was Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rav. Rabbi the Rav was Rabbeinu HaKadosh. So Rav was a Talmud of Rabbeinu HaKadosh, and Rabbi Yirmiyah was a Talmud of Rav. It doesn't mean that it was one-on-one. It means it was with great clarity. So it was with clarity. So anyway, I asked Rebbe B'yichud, Umani Rav, who was my Rebbe? It was Rav. Ikud Ami Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba Amar Rav. Or other people quoted it as saying that Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba said that Rav said Shila says Rebbe B'yichud Umani Rabbeinu HaKadosh. So either it's Rabbi Yirmiyah who asked Rav, or it's Rav who asked Rebbe, and this is what he asked him: My pas ava. What does pas ava mean? It means pas maruba. It means a lot of bread. What does that mean? Pas maruba. Harbi charorim b'yachad. It doesn't necessarily mean that each bread was big. It means there was a lot of small breads. V'lav mishum chimutz tnakatla. And the question wasn't about, since it's a big bread, it might have become chametz. U'v'charorim danka amar. We're even speaking about thin breads. It's just that there were many of them. And the shaila was not a shaila of chametz. It was a shaila, if you bake a lot of breads, it's a tircha yisera, and maybe you wouldn't be able to be involved in the tircha yisera on Yom Tov. Because there's a lot of kneading involved, because the dough you knead all together, even before you separate it into its individual breads. Belisha kishalosh noisa avahi it's thick. Avahi isa kishikula biyachad. When it's all together, that's what's called pasava. But his concern was, are you allowed to make a lot of breads? Okay, let me see where we're holding. Okay, we're at 7:50, so I guess we should stop here. So we'll stop here and we'll pick up here at Misham tomorrow.
Okay, shkoyach.
Shkoyach, have a wonderful day.
Shkoyach.